What if the ultimate evil, chaos itself, desperately craves loyalty? Not the loyalty born of respect or admiration, but something far more insidious, far more absolute. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the ruinous powers do not merely seek to destroy. They hunger for something infinitely more, terrible devotion so complete that the devoted cannot conceive of any other existence. I stood in the ruins of Hadrian's Gate on the hive world of Morthus Prime, watching the smoke rise from the Manufacturum district, where 300,000 workers had immolated themselves in ecstatic devotion to something they called the Crimson Architect. The Arbits had found not a single body that showed signs of restraint or coercion. Every corpse wore the same expression, captured in the final moment before the Prometheum ignited. They were smiling. The inquisitorial report would later classify it as a spontaneous uprising of madness. But I knew better. I had seen the prayer scrolls, read the manifestos scratched into the hab block walls. These people had chosen this fate with the same deliberation that others choose their morning rations. The question that haunted me then, that haunts me still, is how chaos achieves this level of devotion without the visible chains that mark every other form of slavery in the Imperium. The answer lies in a truth more disturbing than any tentacled horror emerging from the warp. Chaos does not break its followers. It convinces them to break themselves, and in doing so, makes them complicit in their own damnation. The process begins not with overt corruption, not with the obvious marks of mutation or demonic possession, but with whispers so subtle that the victim mistakes them for their own thoughts. On the agri-world of Thessalia 7, I interviewed a survivor of a cult dedicated to what they called the Verdant Father. The woman, Mara Kellis, had been a devout servant of the god Emperor, a shrine keeper who tended the sacred flames with meticulous care. She described the beginning of her fall not as a dramatic moment of temptation, but as a series of small, reasonable thoughts that accumulated like dust on an unattended altar. The crops had been failing for 3 seasons. The tithe collectors came regardless, stripping the granaries until children starved in the streets. Mara found herself questioning why the Emperor, who loved his people, would permit such suffering. The thought was not planted by a daemon whispering in her ear. It was her own rational response to an unjust reality. But that thought, that single crack in her faith, became a doorway. The whispers came next, so quiet she never heard them as external voices. They sounded like her own mind working through a problem, finding solutions, connecting dots. What if the Emperor's light had grown too distant, too consumed with cosmic struggles to notice the plight of one small world? What if there were other powers, older powers, that remembered the bounty of ancient terror before the age of strife? What if devotion to growth, to life, to the endless cycle of death and rebirth was not heresy, but simply a different path to salvation? By the time Mara realized she was praying to something other than the Emperor, she had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The entity she now worshipped had given her community what the Imperium could not: full granaries, healthy children, fields bursting with crops that grew with unnatural vigor. The mutations came later, as they always do. First, the crops themselves changed, developing thorns that wept a viscous sap and flowers that screamed when harvested. Then the children who ate the harvest began to change, their skin taking on a greenish hue, their fingers elongating into root-like appendages. By then, Mara could not conceive of returning to the Emperor's light. Not because she feared punishment, but because she genuinely believed she had found a better way. The horror of her situation was not that she had been forced into corruption, but that she had reasoned her way into it, step by logical step, each decision made with full awareness and what she believed to be moral clarity. This is the first and most crucial element of Chaos's method for cultivating absolute loyalty. It creates the illusion of choice, the illusion of free will, while simultaneously engineering every circumstance to ensure the outcome it desires. The Ruinous Powers are not mindless forces of destruction. They are entities of vast intelligence and unfathomable patience, capable of manipulating events across centuries to position a single individual at the exact moment of their breaking. On the Forge world of Metallica, a junior magos named Theron Vex discovered what he believed to be an ancient standard template construct fragment in the archives. The discovery was his own, the result of decades of diligent research and careful analysis. What he could not know was that the fragment had been placed in that archive 700 years earlier by a daemon prince who understood the psychology of the Adeptus Mechanicus better than they understood themselves. The STC fragment contained schematics for weapons of devastating power, but the manufacturing process required a catalytic compound that could only be synthesized using forbidden xenotech principles. Theron faced a choice: report the discovery and watch it be sealed away by hidebound traditionalists who feared innovation, or pursue the knowledge in secret, justifying his actions with the reasoning that the Imperium desperately needed such weapons to survive the encroaching darkness. He chose the latter. He chose it freely, convinced by his own logic that this was the pragmatic, even moral decision. Within 5 years, Theron Vex had transformed from a loyal servant of the Omnissiah into a heretic whose experiments had corrupted 3 entire forge complexes and cost the lives of 12 million servitors and tech priests. When the Inquisition finally cornered him in the depths of his laboratorium, surrounded by machines that wept blood and sang in languages that predated human language itself, he still believed he was serving the Emperor's will. He still believed he had made the right choice. The profound terror of this approach is that it makes the victim an accomplice in their own corruption. There is no moment of coercion to look back on, no daemon holding a bolter to their head, no sorcerer casting a spell of compulsion. Every step was taken willingly, every choice made with apparent freedom. This creates a psychological investment in the path of damnation that no amount of external force could achieve. When confronted with the reality of what they have become, these individuals cannot simply disavow their actions as the product of external manipulation. They must either accept that they freely chose evil, shattering their sense of moral identity, or double down on their commitment to chaos, reframing their corruption as enlightenment. Almost universally, they choose the latter. The alternative is a psychological annihilation more complete than any physical death. But chaos does not rely solely on the manipulation of circumstance and the illusion of choice. Its second method for cultivating absolute loyalty is through the identification and exploitation of pre-existing grievances, offering solutions that appear genuine but are chains disguised as keys to freedom. The Imperium of man is a vast machine of oppression, grinding countless trillions beneath its gears in the name of survival. For every hero defending humanity from alien horrors, there are a billion souls suffering under the weight of unjust systems, corrupt officials, and the simple, crushing burden of existing in a galaxy that views individual lives as nothing more than ammunition to be expended. Chaos understands this. It understands that the most fertile ground for cultivation is not the contented or the secure, but the angry, the grieving, and the righteously indignant. On the cardinal world of Ophelia Turchis, a priest named Gareth Mornsong ministered to the faithful in the lower Hab zones, where the light of the Emperor's shrine barely penetrated the chemical fog of the industrial sector. Gareth was a true believer, a man who had memorized every liturgy and could recite the acts of faith without error. But he also saw the suffering of his flock with clear eyes. He saw children die of preventable diseases, while the planetary governor hosted banquets where food sufficient to feed a Hab block for a month was consumed in a single night. He saw workers crushed in unsafe manufactorums because replacing them was cheaper than maintaining machinery. He saw the ecclesiarchy's own hierarchy consume tithers meant for the poor, building gilded monuments to their own glory, while claiming to serve the emperor's humility. The breaking point came when the daughter of one of Gareth's parishioners, a girl of 14 named Selene, was taken by the Schola Progenium after showing aptitude in the Imperial creed. It should have been a moment of celebration, but the method of her taking was brutal. The enforcers dragging her screaming from her parents' arms in the middle of the night. When Gareth dared to question the necessity of such cruelty, he was reprimanded by his superior for questioning the emperor's servants. That night, alone in his chapel, Gareth prayed for guidance. He asked the emperor to show him how such suffering could be part of a divine plan, how the casual cruelty he witnessed daily could serve any greater good. The answer that came was not the emperor's voice. It was something else, something that understood his pain and his anger in a way he had never felt before. It spoke to him of justice, true justice, not the corrupted mockery the Imperium practiced. It showed him visions of a world where the powerful were held accountable, where the suffering was avenged, where those who preyed on the weak faced consequences. It offered him power, the ability to be the instrument of that justice, to punish the wicked and protect the innocent. Everything it offered was framed in terms of Gareth's own moral framework, appealing to his virtues rather than his vices. It did not ask him to become evil. It asked him to become a hero, a champion of the downtrodden, a sword of righteousness in a corrupt universe. Gareth accepted. Within months, he had gathered a following of the faithful who shared his grievances and his vision of justice. They called themselves the Red Judges, and they began systematically executing those they deemed guilty of exploiting the weak. The executions were brutal, theatrical displays meant to send a message to other oppressors. With each killing, Gareth felt the power he had been promised flowing through him, validating his actions, proving that he walked a righteous path. He did not recognize the nature of that power because it came wrapped in the language of justice, presented as a gift from a benevolent force that shared his values. Only when the mutations began, when his followers started to grow extra eyes that wept blood and developed a hunger for the flesh of their victims, did Gareth begin to suspect that the entity guiding him might not be what he had believed. By then, he was in too deep to turn back. He had committed too many atrocities in the name of justice, killed too many people he could no longer be certain deserved death. The power flowing through him was no longer a gift he could refuse. It had become a necessity, an addiction so profound that the thought of living without it was more terrifying than the knowledge of what he had become. Chaos had identified his genuine grievance with injustice, validated his anger, and then channeled it into a path that transformed him from a righteous priest into a murderous daemon host. The genius of the approach was that every step seemed reasonable at the time, every escalation justified by circumstances, every crossing of a moral boundary explained as necessary to achieve a greater good. This pattern repeats across the galaxy in infinite variations. The soldier betrayed by corrupt commanders who finds solace in the promises of glory eternal through martial perfection. The scholar frustrated by the Imperium's suppression of knowledge who encounters a tome promising enlightenment. The artist whose vision is crushed by a society that values only conformity, offered the ability to create beauty beyond mortal comprehension. In each case, chaos presents itself not as a corrupter, but as a liberator, offering solutions to real problems, appealing to genuine virtues, and framing damnation as salvation. The key is that the solutions are always false. The power comes with strings that eventually strangle. The knowledge drives its possessor to madness. The beauty becomes so alien that it repels all who witness it. But by the time the truth becomes apparent, the victim is already bound by choices they made freely, decisions they cannot unmake, and a dependency on the power they have accepted. The third element of Chaos's methodology for cultivating loyalty is perhaps the most insidious. It achieves absolute devotion not through love, not through respect, not through any positive emotion, but through the systematic erosion of alternatives and self-worth. This process transforms loyalty from an active choice into the only psychologically sustainable option remaining to the corrupted. On the death world of Catachan, where every form of life is hostile and survival requires constant vigilance, a regiment of the Astra Militarum found itself cut off from support during an Orc invasion. For 3 years, they fought without reinforcement, without resupply, watching their numbers dwindle from 5,000 to fewer than 300. The colonel commanding the regiment, a man named Halban Cross, made increasingly desperate decisions to keep his soldiers alive. First, they scavenged equipment from the dead, including the orcs they killed. Then they began using Xeno's weapons when their own ammunition ran out. Then they started consuming the flesh of fallen orcs when their rations were exhausted. Each decision was made in the context of survival, each compromise justified by necessity. But with each step further from Imperial doctrine, the regiment found itself less able to imagine returning to the Imperium they had served. How could they explain the Xeno's taint on their weapons, the alien proteins in their bloodstream, the psychological changes that came from 3 years of isolation and moral compromise? When a Chaos cult made contact with the regiment, offering an alliance against the Orcs, Colonel Cross accepted. It seemed like merely one more practical decision in a long series of them. But this decision opened a door that could not be closed. The cult introduced the regiment to powers that made their desperate fight winnable. Blessings that increased their strength, mutations that enhanced their combat effectiveness, rituals that summoned entities to fight alongside them. The orcs were driven back. The regiment survived, but survival came at a cost the soldiers had not fully understood when they accepted help. The mutations did not stop when the battle ended. The blessings demanded ongoing service to maintain. The entities that had been summoned expected continued worship. Most critically, the psychological journey the regiment had taken had transformed them into something that could never return to the Imperium. They had crossed too many lines, accepted too many tainted gifts, committed too many heresies. The only community that would accept them now was the very cult that had corrupted them. Loyalty to Chaos became not a matter of belief or conviction, but of sheer psychological survival. The alternative was to accept that they had damned themselves and everyone they had ever cared about for nothing, that their 3 years of struggle and sacrifice had transformed them from heroes into monsters. That truth was unbearable. It was easier to reframe their corruption as ascension, their damnation as liberation, their betrayal of the Emperor as evolution beyond a limiting creed. This psychological trap is reinforced by the physical reality of Chaos corruption. The gifts of the Ruinous Powers are not simply cosmetic alterations or temporary enhancements. They fundamentally change the recipient in ways that make retreat agonizing and often impossible. A warrior who accepts the blessings of Khorne finds their body restructured for optimal killing efficiency, their nervous system rewired to derive pleasure from violence, their brain chemistry altered to crave the experience of combat. Attempting to return to civilian life, or even to the disciplined violence of the Astra Militarum, becomes psychologically and physically torturous. The changes are not superficial. They are woven into the fundamental structure of the recipient's being. A scholar who drinks deep from the well of Tiench's knowledge finds their mind expanded in ways that make conventional thought patterns literally painful. The mundane concerns of daily existence become unbearably tedious. The limited perspective of unenhanced human consciousness feels like a cage too small to breathe in. They cannot unknow what they have learned, cannot unsee the patterns they have perceived in the warp's currents, even if they wanted to return to ignorance. the path is closed. Their enhanced awareness is a permanent condition, and that condition is only sustainable within a framework that accepts and utilizes their corrupted knowledge. A follower of Nurgle, who has accepted the Plague Father's gifts, finds their body transformed into a garden of disease, a walking ecosystem of symbiotic infections that have become essential to their continued function. The diseases are not afflictions to be cured, but integrated systems that their body now depends upon. Removing the corruption would mean death, and so they must embrace it, must find ways to view their putrefaction as blessing rather than curse. The devotees of Slaanesh perhaps exemplify this trap most clearly. The Prince of Pleasure offers experiences beyond mortal sensation, pleasures so intense that ordinary existence becomes grey and lifeless by comparison. A person who has experienced the heights of Slaaneshi ecstasy finds themselves unable to derive satisfaction from normal pleasures. Food becomes tasteless, music becomes noise, art becomes banal, love becomes mechanical. The only source of genuine experience becomes the dark powers that granted them enhanced sensation in the first place. They are not loyal to Slaanesh because they love the Dark Prince, but because they literally cannot function without the stimulation that only chaos can provide. They have become addicts whose addiction is written into their neurological and spiritual architecture, and like all addicts, they will do anything. Betray anyone, sacrifice everything to maintain their supply. This method of cultivating loyalty through dependency and erosion of alternatives extends beyond individual corruption to the structure of chaos warbands and cults. These organizations are deliberately designed to create environments where loyalty to chaos becomes the only viable psychological option. New initiates are subjected to rituals that bind them to their fellows through shared transgression. They are made to participate in acts so horrific, so far beyond the pale of acceptability, that they can never be integrated back into normal society. A cultist who has participated in the sacrifice of children, who has tasted human flesh in a demonic sacrament, who has stood by while innocents were tortured to death in the name of dark powers, carries a burden of guilt so profound that acknowledging it would shatter their psyche. The only way to continue functioning is to reframe these acts as sacred, necessary, or even righteous. The cult provides that reframing, offering a moral universe in which the unspeakable becomes holy, the horrific becomes meaningful, and damnation becomes transcendence. The structure ensures that each member is complicit in the crimes of all, creating a web of mutual corruption from which escape is psychologically impossible. Leaving the cult would mean confronting the full weight of one's actions without the supporting narrative that makes them bearable. It would mean accepting that you are a monster, that everything you have done was evil, that everyone you harmed was an innocent victim rather than a necessary sacrifice. This realization is so devastating that the human mind will construct elaborate justifications to avoid it. Chaos exploits this tendency ruthlessly, building loyalty not on faith or conviction, but on the psychological impossibility of admitting the truth about oneself. Yet even this understanding of chaos's methods for cultivating loyalty does not capture the full scope of its insidious approach. There is a fourth element, often overlooked by those who study the Ruinous Powers: the machinations of daemons and chosen champions who serve as the unseen architects of devotion, master manipulators who have spent centuries or even millennia perfecting the art of psychological corruption. These beings do not simply wait for mortals to fall into chaos's grasp through circumstance or weakness. They actively cultivate cults, engineer crises, and manipulate events across generations to create the precise conditions necessary for mass conversion. On the shrine world of Dimmamar, the population had maintained unwavering loyalty to the Emperor for 8,000 years. Their faith was absolute, their devotion beyond question, their resistance to corruption legendary. 3 separate chaos incursions, had been repelled by nothing more than the strength of the population's faith, and their willingness to die rather than compromise their principles. Yet in the span of a single generation, Dimmamar fell to chaos so completely that the Inquisition was forced to order exterminatus to prevent the corruption from spreading. The architect of this impossible conversion was a daemon prince named Morthus, who had been working toward this goal for 400 years before the first visible signs of corruption appeared. Morthus understood that Dimmamar could not be taken by force or obvious temptation. The population's faith was too strong, too deeply woven into the fabric of their culture. So instead, he planted seeds that would grow slowly, invisibly, across generations. He began by infiltrating the world's scholars, subtly altering the religious education of children in ways so minor that no individual change would be noticed. A parable emphasizing the emperor's mercy was quietly de-emphasized in favor of one highlighting his judgment. A prayer focusing on communal strength was gradually modified to emphasize individual salvation. The changes were minute, implemented slowly enough that each generation believed they practiced the same faith as their parents, unaware that the accumulated alterations had significantly shifted the theological foundation of their worship. Simultaneously, Morthus engineered a series of crises designed to create cognitive dissonance between the population's faith and their lived experience. He corrupted a missionary from off-world who arrived to minister to Dimmamar's faithful, using this unwitting agent to spread a virulent plague that the world's medical infrastructure could not combat. The plague was designed to affect children disproportionately, creating a crisis that challenged the population's understanding of the emperor's protection. Why would the emperor, who loved his faithful, allow innocent children to suffer? The question was not planted by chaos worshippers. It emerged organically from the tragedy, but it was a tragedy Morthus had engineered precisely to produce that question. The answers provided by the world's religious authorities were inadequate, relying on platitudes about the emperor's inscrutable wisdom and the redemptive power of suffering. These answers satisfied the older generation, who had decades of faith to sustain them, but rang hollow to parents watching their children die in agony. Into this crack of doubt, Morthus introduced new ideas through carefully positioned agents. Preachers who offered a different interpretation of the emperor's nature, one that emphasized his aspect as a god of strength who rewarded power and punished weakness. The theology was not obviously heretical. It drew from legitimate imperial texts, merely interpreting them through a lens that subtly shifted the understanding of what the emperor valued. The population of Dimmamar, desperate for answers that made sense of their suffering, embraced these new interpretations. They still believed they worshipped the emperor. They did not realize that the entity responding to their prayers was no longer the distant light of the Astronomicon, but something far older and far more interested in their devotion. By the time the Inquisition arrived to investigate reports of unusual cult activity, 3/4 of Dimmamar's population was already lost. They were not frothing heretics covered in mutations. They were faithful servants of what they believed was the emperor, following practices they believed were orthodox, worshipping in forms they had been taught since childhood. The corruption was so deep, so thoroughly integrated into their culture and theology, that most would have died genuinely believing they had remained loyal to the emperor, even as they committed atrocities in the name of powers they did not recognize as the ruinous gods. Morthus had achieved something remarkable. He had corrupted an entire world without most of its population ever realizing they had fallen. Their loyalty to chaos was absolute, because they believed it was loyalty to the emperor, and that belief was the result of 400 years of meticulous psychological manipulation across multiple generations. This pattern of multi-generational cultivation is common among the most successful chaos cults. The cognitor a secret society that has infiltrated the highest levels of imperial government across multiple sectors, was founded over 2,000 years ago by a cabal of rogue psykers seeking protection from the Black Ships. Their original goal was simply survival, finding ways to hide from the Imperium's persecution. But over centuries, as they recruited new members and expanded their influence, their purpose shifted. Exposure to forbidden texts and warp entities gradually corrupted the organization's leadership, transforming it from a mutual protection society into a full-fledged chaos cult. The genius of their approach is that most members of the Cognitar do not know the true nature of the organization they serve. They believe they are part of a network of enlightened individuals working to reform the Imperium from within, to make it more just, more rational, more humane. Only at the highest levels is the chaos worship explicit, and by the time a member reaches those levels, they have been so thoroughly compromised by the actions they have taken on behalf of the organization that revelation of its true nature cannot shock them into defection. The manufactured miracles and manufactured fears that reinforce cult loyalty are another tool in the arsenal of Chaos's architects. A Chaos sorcerer can produce effects that seem miraculous to those unfamiliar with the warp's capabilities. Healing the sick, providing food in times of famine, granting visions that come true, offering protection from enemies. These demonstrations serve multiple purposes. They validate the cult's theology, proving that the powers they worship are real and responsive. They create gratitude and debt among those who benefit, binding them to the cult through obligation. They attract new converts seeking solutions to their problems. Most insidiously, they habituate the population to accepting the cult's power as benevolent, making it easier to accept increasingly disturbing practices as the corruption deepens. The manufactured fears are equally important. Cults create or exaggerate external threats to maintain internal cohesion. They identify enemies, real or imagined, and convince their followers that only the cult's protection stands between them and destruction. This serves to isolate members from outside influences, to justify increasingly extreme measures in the name of defense, and to create a siege mentality that makes loyalty a matter of survival. A cultist who believes that leaving the cult means death at the hands of enemies surrounding them on all sides will not leave, even if they have doubts about the cult's practices or teachings. The fear keeps them in place, and time erodes their resistance as they become more deeply enmeshed in the cult's activities and worldview. The psychological sophistication of these manipulation techniques cannot be overstated. The greatest servants of chaos are not brutal thugs or mindless zealots, but master manipulators who understand human psychology with a depth that would make the finest Imperial interrogators envious. They know how to identify vulnerabilities, how to exploit insecurities, how to create dependencies, how to erode resistance incrementally, so that the victim never perceives a single moment of coercion. They are patient, willing to invest decades or even centuries in corrupting a single valuable target. They are adaptable, shifting strategies when one approach proves ineffective. They are thorough, leaving nothing to chance when the stakes justify the effort. On the fortress world of Calth, an Astartes librarian named Therion of the Ultramarines spent 2 centuries investigating chaos corruption within the Ultramar sector. His knowledge of chaos tactics, psychology, and methodology was encyclopedic. He had purged 17 cults, identified and eliminated 12 heretic Astartes warbands, and contributed to the Imperial understanding of chaos corruption through hundreds of detailed reports. He was considered one of the Imperium's foremost experts on recognizing and resisting chaos influence. He was also, by the time of his eventual discovery and execution, one of the most effective agents of Tzeentch operating within the Imperium. His corruption had begun 150 years into his service, so subtly that he had not recognized it as corruption. He believed he was developing new techniques, for combating chaos, strategies that required understanding the enemy's perspective in depth. The line between understanding chaos and serving it is finer than most dare to acknowledge, and Therion crossed it without ever perceiving the transition. His story illustrates a profound truth about chaos loyalty. The most devoted servants are often those who believe they are resisting corruption, even as they facilitate it. They have been so thoroughly manipulated that their very opposition to chaos serves chaos ends. They have become instruments playing a role in schemes they cannot perceive, loyal not to chaos as they understand it, but to a version of reality that chaos has constructed for them. This is loyalty at its most absolute, the devotion of someone who does not even realize they are devoted, who would die denying their allegiance, even as their actions serve no other master. Yet for all of chaos's sophistication in cultivating loyalty, for all the psychological manipulation and multi-generational planning and erosion of alternatives and manufactured dependencies, there remains a final, terrible truth about the nature of devotion to the ruinous powers. All of this effort, all of this careful cultivation of perfect loyalty is ultimately a prelude to inevitable betrayal. Chaos does not value loyalty for its own sake. It values loyalty as a tool for extracting maximum utility from mortal servants before discarding them. The daemons who spend centuries cultivating a cult do not do so out of genuine care for their followers, but because devoted followers are more useful than unwilling slaves. The chaos champions who build warbands and inspire fanatical devotion do so not because they value their followers' lives, but because loyal troops fight more effectively than conscripts. The dark gods themselves grant blessings and answer prayers not out of benevolence, but because empowered servants can accomplish more in the material realm than weak ones. This utilitarian approach to loyalty means that even the most devoted servant of chaos is ultimately expendable. I witnessed this truth firsthand on the daemon world of Sarkulo, where I had been imprisoned for 3 months in the dungeons of a word-bearer's warband. The Dark Apostle leading the warband, a traitor named Morthus, had served the Dark Gods for 4,000 years. His devotion was absolute, his faith unshakable, his effectiveness in spreading corruption legendary. He commanded 17 companies of traitor marines and had converted dozens of worlds to chaos worship. By any measure, he was one of chaos's most successful servants. During my imprisonment, I was forced to witness one of the warband's great rituals, a summoning meant to bring forth a greater daemon of Tzeentch, to lead an assault on a nearby Imperial world. The ritual required sacrifice, as such things always do, but the sacrifice demanded was not of slaves or prisoners. It was Morthus himself. The daemon, when it finally manifested, spoke with a voice that scraped against sanity. It thanked Morthus for his millennia of service, praised his devotion, acknowledged his countless contributions to the cause of change and corruption. And then it consumed him, body and soul. Because the ritual demanded a sacrifice of great spiritual power, and Morthus, by virtue of his devotion and service, had made himself valuable enough to serve that purpose. His final moments were not a betrayal from his perspective. He went willingly, even eagerly, into oblivion, believing that this ultimate sacrifice was the pinnacle of his service. The daemon did not mourn him. The warband, after a perfunctory ceremony, elected a new Dark Apostle and continued with their plans. Morthus was forgotten within a week, his millennia of service reduced to a footnote in a ritual that was itself merely one of thousands the warband had performed. This is the inevitable endpoint of chaos loyalty. No matter how devoted, no matter how useful, no matter how successful, every servant of chaos eventually becomes expendable. The warp does not sustain permanent relationships. Daemons do not form genuine bonds. The dark gods do not remember individual mortals once their utility has been exhausted. A champion of Khorne who has won 10,000 battles will be discarded without hesitation if an 11th battle presents an opportunity for a more valuable piece to advance. A sorcerer of Tianch, who has unraveled the secrets of reality itself, will be sacrificed to fuel a ritual if the scheme requires it. A plague cultist who has spread Nurgle's gifts across 100 worlds will be abandoned to die alone when their usefulness ends. A devotee of Slaanesh, who has provided millennia of exquisite sensations, will be discarded like a broken instrument when a new source of pleasure presents itself. The tragic irony is that this betrayal is not a failure of the system from Chaos's perspective. It is the system working exactly as designed. Chaos cultivates absolute loyalty, not to preserve its servants, but to extract maximum value from them before their inevitable disposal. The more loyal a servant, the more they will sacrifice, the more they will endure, the more they will accomplish before they are finally consumed. The psychological and spiritual conditioning that creates absolute devotion also creates a willingness to accept one's own destruction as meaningful, even glorious. The cultist who has been taught that service to chaos is the highest calling will die in that service, believing they have achieved transcendence, even as they are simply discarded ammunition in an eternal war that cares nothing for individual fates. I have seen chaos champions who conquered worlds in the name of their gods, who committed atrocities beyond counting, who transformed themselves into living engines of corruption, all in pursuit of rewards and ascension that never came. I have watched sorcerers who traded everything they were for power discover that the power came with strings that eventually strangled them. I have witnessed the moment when devoted followers realized they had been used, that their loyalty had been exploited, that the promises made to them were lies designed to extract service. The reaction is almost always the same. Not rage at the betrayal, not despair at the revelation, but a desperate attempt to reframe the situation, to find meaning in the meaningless, to convince themselves that their suffering serves some greater purpose, even as they are ground into nothing by powers that never cared whether they lived or died. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Chaos's approach to loyalty. It has conditioned its servants so thoroughly that they will accept their own betrayal as part of the natural order, as something they should have expected, even as something glorious. A word-bearer whose entire company is sacrificed as a distraction while the main force completes an objective will thank his dark gods with his final breath for the opportunity to serve. A sorcerer whose accumulated mutations finally consume his mind will perceive the loss of his sanity as ascension to a higher state of being. A plague-bearer whose body finally succumbs to the diseases he carries will welcome death as a return to Nurgle's garden. They have been so perfectly conditioned to view everything through the lens of service to chaos that they cannot recognize betrayal even when it destroys them. The question that haunts me, that drove me to write this account even knowing it will be declared heretical by any who read it, is what this says about the nature of loyalty itself. If chaos can manufacture perfect devotion through manipulation, psychological conditioning, erosion of alternatives, and the creation of dependencies, if it can make servants so loyal that they willingly embrace their own destruction in service to powers that view them as disposable tools, then what does that say about loyalty in general? Is there any difference between the cultivated devotion of a chaos cultist and the conditioned loyalty of an Imperial soldier? Both are taught from birth that service is the highest calling, that individual life is meaningless compared to the greater cause, that death in service is glorious. Both are subjected to psychological conditioning designed to suppress doubt and ensure obedience. Both exist in systems that will sacrifice them without hesitation when strategic necessity demands it. The Imperium would argue that the difference is in the nature of what is served. The Emperor, despite his grim requirements and terrible demands, serves humanity's survival. Chaos serves only itself, feeding on the suffering it creates, growing stronger from the devotion it extracts. But from the perspective of the individual ground beneath either system, does the distinction matter? The soldier dying in a trench on some forgotten world, bleeding out while calling the Emperor's name, is just as dead as the cultist sacrificed on a dark altar. Both died loyal. Both died believing their death meant something. Both were wrong about mattering to the powers they served. Perhaps the true horror of chaos's secret is not that it creates false loyalty, but that it reveals the mechanism by which all loyalty is manufactured. It shows us the techniques, the psychological levers, the social pressures, the erosion of alternatives, the creation of dependencies, the conditioning that transforms free-willed individuals into devoted servants. The Imperium uses many of the same techniques. It identifies grievances and offers solutions in the form of service. It creates environments where loyalty becomes the only psychologically sustainable option. It binds individuals through shared transgression, the blood of enemies creating bonds between soldiers that cannot be broken. It manufactures miracles through the acts of saints and the intervention of what it claims are the Emperor's angels, while manufacturing fears of aliens, heretics, and daemons to maintain internal cohesion. The difference, if there is one, lies perhaps in the endpoint. The Imperium's betrayal of its servants is at least honest in its brutality. A guardsman knows he will likely die. An Astartes accepts that death in battle is his only fate. The Imperium does not promise transcendence or reward beyond the abstract satisfaction of having served humanity. It offers only duty, suffering, and death, and it delivers exactly what it promises. Chaos, by contrast, promises power, knowledge, pleasure, and life eternal. It offers ascension to daemonhood, transformation into something beyond mortal limitation, rewards proportional to service. These promises are lies, not complete lies, which would be easier to identify, but partial truths wrapped in deception. Some few servants of chaos do achieve daemonhood, do gain the power and immortality promised. But the cost of that transformation is the complete obliteration of everything that made them individuals. A daemon prince is not the person elevated, but something wearing their memories like a poorly fitted garment. The consciousness that survives the transformation is so fundamentally altered that calling it the same being is a semantic convenience rather than a meaningful truth. The soul that was Ankh-Morpor's did not ascend when it was consumed in that ritual. It was destroyed, its spiritual energy harvested to fuel something else entirely. The daemons who promise ascension to their followers are not lying, exactly. They are offering a reward that technically exists, while concealing that accepting the reward means ceasing to exist in any meaningful sense. This brings us to the final paradox at the heart of chaos's cultivation of loyalty. The Ruinous Powers need devoted followers to accomplish their aims in the material realm, but the very nature of chaos ensures that absolute loyalty is ultimately self-destructive. A servant who is completely loyal will do anything required, including actions that accelerate their own corruption and hasten their inevitable consumption. The more effective a servant becomes, the more valuable they are, as a sacrifice or a component in some greater working. The most loyal servants are the ones most likely to be betrayed, because they have made themselves both useful and vulnerable, and chaos always exploits vulnerability. I spoke earlier of Marakellis, the shrine keeper who fell to what she believed was the verdant father. I did not tell you how her story ended. When the Inquisition came to Thessalia 7, they found a world transformed. The crops that had saved the population from starvation had spread beyond the fields, consuming the cities themselves. Buildings were wrapped in thorny vines that pulsed with unnatural life. The air itself had thickened with spores that transformed those who breathed them. The children whose health had been restored by the dark power's gifts had become something other than human. Their bodies gardens of mutation that spread corruption through mere proximity. Mara stood at the center of it all, transformed into a living nexus of the power she had invited into her world. Her body had become a tree of flesh and bone, roots spreading deep into the planetary crust, branches reaching toward the sky, fruit growing from her limbs that contained the souls of those she had led into damnation. She was still conscious, still aware, but her perspective had been so warped by the transformation that she perceived the horror around her as beauty, the suffering as growth, the damnation of billions as salvation. When the Inquisitor confronted her, offering one final chance at redemption through confession and repentance, she laughed. The sound was wind through dead leaves, branches scraping against stone. She told him that she had achieved everything she sought, that she had saved her world, that the suffering under the Imperium was ended and replaced with something greater. The Inquisitor, a man named Covenant whom I served as an interrogator for 30 years, did something I had never seen him do before. He wept, not for Mara, who was far beyond any help or pity, but for the waste of it, for the genuine faith and compassion that had been twisted into something monstrous, for the fact that chaos had taken someone who truly wanted to help others and transformed her into an engine of damnation, all while convincing her that she was fulfilling her highest purpose. He ordered the exterminatus with a heavy heart, knowing that it was the only mercy available to the billions suffering on Thessalia 7. As we watched the planet burn from orbit, he asked me a question that I have never forgotten. If chaos can take our virtues and use them against us, if it can transform compassion into a tool of corruption, if it can make loyalty itself a weapon of damnation, then what defense do we have? How do we resist an enemy that attacks us through the very qualities that make us worth defending? I had no answer for him then. I have no answer now. The truth is that there may be no perfect defense against chaos's methods of cultivating loyalty. The psychological techniques it employs are too sophisticated, too well refined by millennia of practice, too perfectly adapted to exploit the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. We are meaning-making creatures. We need to believe that our suffering serves a purpose, that our choices matter, that our loyalty is meaningful. Chaos understands this need and weaponizes it with ruthless efficiency. The best defense, perhaps, is awareness. To understand that loyalty itself can be a trap, that devotion can be manufactured, that the conviction we feel about our choices may be the product of manipulation we cannot perceive. To question not just obvious temptations, but the subtle ones that appeal to our virtues rather than our vices. To recognize that the most dangerous corruptions are those that feel righteous, that align with our existing beliefs, that seem to make us better rather than worse. To accept that sometimes the most loyal thing we can do is to doubt, to question, to resist even when resistance seems unreasonable. But even this awareness is not protection enough. I know the techniques chaos uses. I can identify the patterns, recognize the manipulation, see the trap before it closes. Yet I also know that this knowledge is incomplete, that there are layers of deception beyond my understanding, that my very confidence in my ability to resist may itself be a form of corruption. Tinch, the architect of fate, is known for schemes within schemes, for making the belief that one has escaped corruption into a form of corruption itself. The paranoia that protects against chaos influence can be twisted into a tool of chaos influence. There is no stable ground, no position of perfect safety from which to resist. The survivors of Hadrian's Gate, the massacre that began my investigation into chaos's methods of cultivating loyalty, were all subjected to extensive interrogation and testing for signs of corruption. Of the 2,000 individuals who did not participate in the mass immolation, 93 were found to be tainted and executed. But I often wonder about the remaining survivors, the ones judged clean and allowed to return to their lives. Were they truly untouched by whatever influence drove 300,000 of their neighbors to burn themselves alive? Or were they simply more subtly corrupted, their contamination too deep or too sophisticated for our tests to detect? Are they living as time bombs, waiting for the right trigger to activate the programming that chaos embedded in their psyches? Or am I seeing threats where none exist, allowing the fear of corruption to poison my perception of innocent survivors? There is no way to know. That is the ultimate weapon in Chaos's arsenal. Not the mutations or the daemons or the sorcerous power, but the uncertainty. The knowledge that we can never be completely sure who is corrupted and who is clean, what thoughts are our own and what have been planted, which loyalties are genuine and which are manufactured. This uncertainty erodes trust, degrades cooperation, and transforms every human interaction into a potential vector for corruption. A society constantly vigilant against chaos influence becomes paranoid, brutal, and oppressive. A society that lowers its guard becomes infiltrated and ultimately consumed. There is no balance point between these extremes, no sweet spot where vigilance and trust coexist. We lurch between paranoia and complacency, and chaos benefits from both extremes. The pilgrim fleets that travel the galaxy seeking holy sites are a perfect example of this impossible balance. These fleets contain millions of faithful believers seeking to strengthen their connection to the Emperor through visiting places sanctified by his presence or the presence of his saints. The faith of these pilgrims is genuine, their devotion sincere, their intentions pure. But the very concentration of faith that makes these fleets powerful also makes them targets. Chaos cults infiltrate the pilgrims, hiding among the faithful, using the cover of religious fervor to mask their own darker rituals. The Inquisition monitors these fleets constantly, looking for signs of corruption, but cannot police millions of individuals effectively. Innocent pilgrims are sometimes caught in purges targeting cultists. Actual cultists sometimes escape detection and spread their influence to new worlds when the fleet makes port. The fleet masters face an impossible choice. Implement strict security measures that treat every pilgrim as a potential threat, destroying the communal faith and trust that makes pilgrimage meaningful in the first place, or maintain a more open environment that preserves the spiritual purpose of the journey, while accepting that some degree of chaos infiltration is inevitable. Different fleet masters make different choices, and chaos benefits regardless of which path they choose. The security-focused fleets create environments of fear and suspicion that make pilgrims more vulnerable to chaos whispers offering liberation from oppression. The faith-focused fleets create opportunities for chaos cults to spread more effectively. There is no winning move, only different forms of losing. This same dynamic plays out across the Imperium at every level. The administrator must balance efficiency against security, knowing that streamlined systems are easier to infiltrate, but that excessive security measures create the very inefficiencies and grievances that make populations vulnerable to chaos promises of better governance. The Astra Militarum must balance unit cohesion against the risk that tight-knit units are more vulnerable to collective corruption. The Inquisition must balance investigative thoroughness against the need to act quickly, knowing that slow investigations allow corruption to spread, while hasty action may destroy innocent lives and create the grievances that feed chaos recruitment. Every institution in the Imperium faces these impossible balances, and chaos has learned to exploit all of them. The secret of Chaos's success in cultivating absolute loyalty is that it does not need to win everywhere. It only needs to find the cracks, the breaking points, the individuals and communities where the Imperium's impossible balances have failed. In a galaxy of countless trillions, there are always such places. Always individuals suffering under injustice, always communities where the Imperium's protection has failed, always soldiers betrayed by their commanders, always scholars frustrated by institutional blindness, always faithful believers whose prayers seem to go unanswered. Chaos does not need to create these situations, though it does when possible. It simply needs to find them and offer its false solutions, its poisoned gifts, its manufactured meaning for meaningless suffering. The scale of this operation is difficult to comprehend. The Ruinous Powers are not individual entities focused on single schemes, but vast, distributed intelligences operating across the entire galaxy simultaneously. Every daemon, every possessed, every chaos champion is an extension of these greater wills, working toward goals that may take centuries or millennia to unfold. The mortal cultist performing a ritual in a basement hab on some forgotten hive world is unknowingly part of a scheme that connects to actions taken on 1,000 other worlds, all fitting together into a pattern that serves purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The loyalty that chaos cultivates is not just the devotion of individuals to dark powers, but the integration of those individuals into vast networks of corruption that span space and time. I have seen the evidence of this coordination in the archives I was allowed to access during my service with the Inquisition. Chaos cults on worlds separated by thousands of light years, with no possible conventional contact between them, performing identical rituals on the same dates. Rebellions breaking out simultaneously across multiple sectors, each claiming local grievances, but all following the same tactical patterns and using the same rhetoric. Artifacts appearing in locations where they could not possibly have been transported, positioned precisely to corrupt specific individuals at specific moments. The evidence of vast, patient intelligence behind chaos corruption is overwhelming to anyone who looks at the patterns, rather than individual incidents. Yet even knowing this, even understanding the scope and sophistication of Chaos's operations, the Imperium cannot effectively counter it. The Inquisition can identify and purge individual cults, but new ones emerge to replace them. The Grey Knights can banish daemons, but more await in the warp. The Sisters of Battle can burn heretics, but new heretics are created by the very brutality required to suppress the old ones. Every victory against chaos is temporary. Every purge creates new grievances. Every act of vigilance against corruption creates the conditions for different forms of corruption to take root. The war against chaos is not one that can be won, only endured, and the endurance itself is a form of suffering that feeds the very enemy being resisted. This is the final secret of Chaos's approach to loyalty. It does not need to corrupt everyone, or even most people. It merely needs to create and maintain a sufficient level of corruption to sustain itself, and the nature of the Imperium ensures that this threshold will always be met. The Imperium is built on suffering, on the grinding oppression of countless trillions, on systems so vast and callous that individual lives mean nothing. This suffering is not incidental to the Imperium's function, but essential to it. The Imperium requires the suffering to survive, to maintain the vast machine of war, that is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. But that same suffering is the fuel that feeds chaos, the raw material from which devotion is cultivated. The Imperium creates the very conditions that make chaos corruption possible, and cannot cease creating those conditions without collapsing entirely. Thus the paradox is complete. The Imperium must be brutal, oppressive, and uncaring to survive. That brutality creates the grievances that make populations vulnerable to chaos corruption. Fighting chaos requires even more brutality, creating even more grievances, feeding the cycle. The more successfully the Imperium fights chaos, the stronger chaos becomes. The more it tries to protect humanity from corruption, the more suffering it creates, and suffering is the gateway through which chaos reaches the faithful. There is no solution to this paradox, no clever strategy that breaks the cycle. There is only the endless war, the eternal struggle, the grim darkness of a future where humanity slowly strangles itself, trying to survive. And through it all, chaos cultivates loyalty. Absolute, unshakable, ultimately meaningless loyalty from servants, who believe they have found purpose in the void, who think they have made choices when they were manipulated, who imagine they are valued when they are merely useful, who trust in promises that will never be kept. The secret is not that chaos achieves this loyalty through some mystical power beyond comprehension. The secret is that chaos achieves it through techniques painfully familiar to anyone who has studied systems of control and manipulation. The secret is that loyalty itself, that quality we hold up as virtuous, as noble, as the foundation of civilization, can be manufactured, can be exploited, can be turned into a weapon against the loyal. What does that say about the nature of devotion? If the cultist burning himself alive on Hadrian's gate feels the same conviction, the same certainty, the same peace in his loyalty as the sister of battle charging into certain death in the emperor's name, then what distinguishes one from the other? Both are loyal. Both are devoted. Both will die for what they believe. The difference lies not in the quality of their loyalty, but in what they are loyal to. But even that distinction collapses under scrutiny, because both the cultist and the sister believe they serve righteousness. Both have been convinced through similar techniques that their cause is just. Both have had their loyalty cultivated through manipulation they do not fully perceive. The thought is heretical. I know it is heretical even as I write it. But heresy and truth are not always opposites, and the most dangerous truths are those that undermine the foundations on which we build meaning. If loyalty can be manufactured, if devotion can be engineered, if absolute faith can be created through psychological manipulation regardless of the object of that faith, then perhaps loyalty itself is not the virtue we believe it to be. Perhaps loyalty is simply a tool, neutral in itself, made good or evil only by what it serves. Perhaps the sister of battle is not more virtuous than the cultist, merely more fortunate in the object of her devotion. Perhaps we are all cultists of one form or another, all having had our loyalty cultivated through techniques we did not recognize, all serving powers that view us as expendable regardless of the names we give those powers. These thoughts led to my fall from the Inquisition's service. Not because I betrayed the Emperor or turned to chaos, but because I could no longer perform my duties with the certainty they required. When you understand how loyalty is manufactured, when you see the techniques clearly, when you recognize that the devotion you feel toward the Emperor was cultivated through the same psychological mechanisms that create devotion to the ruinous powers, you cannot maintain the absolute conviction necessary to condemn others for their corruption. You see too much of yourself in the heretic, too much of the heretic in yourself. The line between the faithful and the fallen becomes not a wall but a membrane, permeable and uncertain. And standing on one side of that membrane while judging those on the other becomes an act you cannot justify even to yourself. I write this account knowing it will likely be found and declared heretical. I write it knowing that readers will see it as evidence of corruption, as proof that my doubts were themselves a form of chaos influence. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps my inability to maintain faith in the face of understanding is itself a failure, a victory for chaos that proves the necessity of ignorance as a bulwark against corruption. Perhaps the examined life is incompatible with survival in a universe where malevolent intelligences can weaponize self-awareness itself. Perhaps doubt is a luxury humanity cannot afford when the alternative is extinction. But I also know that willful ignorance is not protection. That blind faith is not virtue. That loyalty unexamined is loyalty vulnerable to manipulation. The techniques chaos uses to cultivate devotion work because they exploit real weaknesses in human psychology, real vulnerabilities in how we construct meaning and identity. Understanding those techniques does not make us immune to them, but it at least offers the possibility of recognizing manipulation when it occurs, of maintaining some measure of autonomy even in a universe that seems designed to strip autonomy away. The final question remains, What does Chaos's secret, its terrifying need for unwavering allegiance, achieved through such insidious methods, tell us about the nature of true devotion? Can there be such a thing as true devotion in a universe where loyalty can be manufactured? Is the Sister of Battle's faith in the Emperor any more real than the cultist's faith in the dark gods, if both were created through similar psychological conditioning? Does authenticity of devotion even matter, or is the only meaningful distinction the consequences of that devotion for oneself and others? I do not have answers to these questions. I am not certain answers exist. What I have instead is a terrible awareness that the war against chaos is not merely a war of weapons and worlds, but a war of meaning itself. Chaos seeks not just to destroy humanity, but to prove that human virtue is meaningless, that our highest values are simply tools to be exploited, that our capacity for devotion and sacrifice and loyalty makes us not noble but vulnerable. The Imperium's response is to double down on those virtues, to demand even greater loyalty, even deeper devotion, even more absolute faith, refusing to acknowledge that these demands may be playing into Chaos's hands. Somewhere between blind faith and paralyzing doubt, between unquestioning loyalty and cynical betrayal, there must be a path that offers genuine resistance to Chaos's manipulation. But finding that path requires examining the very foundations of what we believe about devotion, loyalty, and faith. It requires acknowledging that these virtues, which we have always held to be absolute goods, can be twisted into tools of damnation. It requires accepting that the devoted can be wrong, that the loyal can be deceived, that faith itself can lead to evil, when directed toward evil ends or cultivated through evil means. These are not comfortable truths. They undermine the certainties on which the Imperium is built, the absolute convictions necessary to maintain discipline across a galaxy-spanning civilization constantly besieged by existential threats. But uncomfortable truths do not cease to be true simply because accepting them is difficult. Chaos's darkest secret, its most insidious victory, is not the corruption of individuals, but the revelation that corruption and devotion may be separated by nothing more than perspective, that the mechanisms creating one are indistinguishable from the mechanisms creating the other. In the end, we are left with a universe where loyalty itself has become suspect, where devotion must be constantly questioned even as it is demanded, where faith must be examined even as examination itself may be a path to damnation. This is the reality that chaos has created through its cultivation of absolute loyalty. Not a galaxy conquered by force, but a galaxy where the very virtues that make us human have been transformed into weapons wielded against us. Not the destruction of meaning, but the corruption of meaning itself, the transformation of our highest values into our deepest vulnerabilities. And yet we endure. Humanity persists, battered and brutalized, paranoid and oppressed, but persisting nonetheless. Perhaps that persistence itself is the answer, the refusal to surrender even in the face of impossible odds and unbearable truths. Perhaps the resistance to chaos lies not in perfect faith or absolute loyalty, but in the stubborn, irrational determination to continue existing, continue fighting, continue searching for meaning even in a universe that seems designed to render meaning impossible. Perhaps the Emperor's true gift to humanity was not the Imperium or the conquest of the galaxy, but simply the example of suffering that refuses to yield, of will that persists beyond reason, of humanity that endures despite everything, or perhaps that thought too, is simply another form of the manipulation I have tried to illuminate, another layer of meaning manufactured to make bearable the unbearable truth that we are all trapped in systems of control we cannot escape, all loyal to powers that view us as expendable, all devoted to causes that will betray us in the end. There is no way to know with certainty. There is only the choice to continue or to surrender, and even that choice may be less free than we imagine. In the grim darkness of the far future, Even our choices may be nothing more than pre-programmed responses in schemes beyond our comprehension, and our loyalty nothing more than the chains we forged ourselves at the whispered suggestion of powers we never fully perceived. This is Chaos's darkest secret, and it is a secret that cannot be forgotten once known.